Chapter 12, Work and Workplace for Social Problems. Okay, so first, to understand the US economy in the current context, we have to talk about the history and specifically the structural changes that, specifically how the Industrial Revolution, the Information Revolution, and how globalization have really changed the character of work. And, what it means to work, how we go about those things, how we receive compensation. A lot of that has to do with these larger structural changes. So, first off, obviously, the Industrial Revolution, which is so incredibly important to kind of setting us on a particular path that we've been on for a long time in this, kind of capitalistic sense. So throughout the 19th century, most people in the US actually lived in rural areas, right? Small towns where they produced more raw materials, right? They would farm, they would ranch, they would mine, they would fish, they would clear the forest, right? Things like that. But the Industrial Revolution, because of the kinds of technology that came with it, right? You had all sorts of factory labor jobs created, right? Using mechanical means to create consumer products. And so this basically caused a whole new change in the way that people worked and what kind of jobs they could find. So you were no longer stuck on a specific plot of land. And so a lot of people moved to city areas where these first burgeoning factories were set up. So you have this huge change from 1900, where the majority of people are living in more rural areas, producing goods, connected to the land in that kind of way, versus, within a short period of time, you had tens of millions of people attracted to the growing cities, whether it was in Europe or other parts of the world, and of course in the United States. And so you had, in the US, 80% of people living in rural areas. That swapped by the 1930s to almost 80% of people living in cities instead of rural areas. So clearly this, within one generation, dramatically changed the way that people worked, and even the way that we understood the family form, right? Because families used to be understood in much more of a kind of larger family context, multi-generational families, extended family. But this concept of the nuclear family is really, really closely tied to the Industrial Revolution. This is when we get this ethos, because it's going to make you more mobile. Meaning if you're just worried about taking care of your family, means your spouse and your children, then you can just up and move to the city and get a better job. But if your concept of family is larger kind of extended family forms and you have to help support in that way, then you're going to be more connected to the family and less likely to up and move, right? So even the concept of our ideal family in the United States is very closely tied to capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. So just a fun fact there. So anyway, we had this big influx of, again, what we wouldn't necessarily consider technology by today's standards, but they were big technological advances that made it so people could actually use machines and have more productivity instead of doing things with animals, like having, let's say, an oxen drive a cart. You could have, a machine till the soil, and that was just much more effective, right? And so, again, this changed a lot of the ways that people lived in their daily lives. So you also had the kind of changes that were taking place with deindustrialization in the 50s and 60s. So, okay, before I can get to that, I have to talk about how, because of the spread of technology, we had this thing called the Information Revolution that was starting to develop, right? Actually, we'll talk about that in a moment. So deindustrialization is just the decline of industrial production. So meaning all of those factories that were providing, often, well, not at the beginning of factory labor, right? They're very exploitive. But, near this time in the 1950s, you had a lot of factory labor jobs were union organized jobs. So they paid fair wages so that, with one family earner, so typically a man, he could work in a factory and make enough money to support his family, right? Of course, women also worked in factories, as did children, especially in that early part of the Industrial Revolution, right? In those kind of like 1900s cities, very common for, children and, again, for women who were poor or immigrants to work within factory labor. So anyway, deindustrialization happens. Basically, companies realize that they can start doing production from other areas of the globe and pay people less, right? So this is when more and more of those factories start to move, is the 50s and 60s. And so the 50s it started to happen, but really accelerated throughout the 60s and 70s to the point where it kind of led to what we now know as globalization, which again, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but basically what you need to understand from this is that the people that lived in the cities relied heavily on those factory jobs for labor. And once that labor left, this was also corresponded with a white flight of a lot of more information workers to what was built as the suburbs, right? But these were white collar service work jobs. And so those were only, available to certain people. And again, even the neighborhoods themselves were racially segregated. So you have this situation where when deindustrialization negatively impacted cities, it didn't impact everybody. It just impacted people that got stuck there, especially those who had, faced redlining and other situations where they kind of just became stuck within these cities. And nothing came in to replace that deindustrialization. So this is when we start to see the kind of rapid decline of inner city areas. Anywho, so let's jump into the rest of this before I get there, before I cut to it too early. So the information revolution is basically when the invention of computer technology makes it so that we start having jobs about information and less about like making a product in a factory and more about using our brains to develop some sort of knowledge, or sometimes just even jobs about organizing knowledge, right? I work at a library, just there's archivists or people that just work to organize or maintain a specific collection of information, right? So the information revolution created all of these kind of, newer white collar service jobs. And again, that corresponded with that white flight to the suburbs in the 1950s and 60s. So it's interesting, as there's this kind of impact negatively economically within the cities, you see those with the most power, right? The typically white men in this economic context were able to transition their work to these kind of more white collar jobs and move to areas that could financially support their families. So anywho, I know this is a lot to go over very briefly, but it's just important to understand how deindustrialization led to a lot of the negative issues that we talk about with globalization. So again, globalization is just the expansion of economic activity around the world without real regard for national borders. And so global expansion of the economy has been good for most corporations, right? Because they make more money when they can sell in more markets. But at the same time, the loss of industrial and service jobs here in the US has been bad for many US working families. Because again, there hasn't been a lot of opportunities to come in and replace those things. Especially if you're talking about, factory labor, union jobs that paid healthy wages, that then, only thing that replaces that is retail jobs with minimum wage. That's very difficult to support a family on the minimum wage. We know that that's not capable, right? That if you're a minimum wage worker, you can't afford a decent 2-bedroom apartment in any state in the United States. So even though different states have different, minimum wages, it doesn't matter. It's the idea that the minimum wage isn't a living wage. So it doesn't really support people and their families. So globalization is really connected to these consequences of the past, and really to the fact that because of technology, like think about it, if you use computers, if you use teleconferencing, things like this, you don't have to be in the same place at the same time. So for instance, we talk about deindustrialization, but part of this is also what we call offshoring or outsourcing. So offshoring is when you take an entire business and you move it to another country, right? Like factory garment labor, car manufacturing, stuff like that. And then outsourcing is when you take a job that's traditionally done in a local area and you send it to another place. So this, for a great example of this would be anytime you call a 1-800 number, you're often talking to people in like India. Why? Because they speak English, they have college educations, but they can be paid far less than US workers. Like I used to know folks that were those jobs that maybe back in the early aughts, I should say, the early 2000s, those kind of jobs were like 15 to 18 bucks an hour, which was a pretty good wage back then, right? It wasn't super fancy, but it was something that you could actually, pay your bills with. All of those jobs are now gone. They've taken all those call centers and moved them to other countries because, again, they can pay someone $5 or $6 instead of 15 or 20. And it's kind of comes back to what Marx talks about, this idea of surplus value, that your boss never pays you what you're worth, right? That basically, let's say they pay you $15 an hour, but what you're productively earning for the company is $30 an hour, right? They're not basically saying, okay, well, you earn us $30 an hour, so we're going to pay you $25 an hour and take that $5 off the top. No, they'll pay you $15 an hour and take that $15 an hour off the top. So think about it that way. If they can then, instead of paying someone $15 an hour, pay them $5, that's another $10 of surplus value per hour that they're making per person. So the whole incentive of globalization when it comes to expanding markets, not just to sell more goods in other places, that's part of it, but to move production and manufacturing to other places around the globe, a lot of the motivation is that surplus value, making more money off of paying people less. And we're talking like people that make garments are making, cents a day, or maybe $2 a week versus, if you were paying someone a union wage here in the US, you'd be paying them, over $20 an hour to work in that same condition. So, we don't have enough time to really get into a lot of those issues, but that's a huge one when it comes to the fact that we talk about, sweatshops being a thing of the past or something that was a part of our early history in the US, right? Like that whole Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire situation. But we don't really realize that it's still happening. It's just out of sight, out of mind, right? That a lot of these industries, like all this stuff that we have, comes from somewhere. It's manufactured somewhere. And often the environmental protections, the worker protections are not there in the same way as they are in more organized countries that have been able to kind of win those rights. Why? Because then you actually have to pay workers and make sure you're not, dumping toxic chemicals into waterways and things like this. So corporations realize this, and then they try and get around that by just going to countries with more and more lax rules and regulations. And then when a country starts to, or the workers themselves try to become more organized, they just move it somewhere else. So it is a very exploited process, right? But people that are pro-capitalistic would say, well, that's just making money, that's business, right? And that they would say that, well, you're bringing jobs to people all over the world. But really, it's quite a destabilization when you rely upon a factory and then it leaves. Whether it's a $30 an hour factory labor job in the US that leaves and is replaced with minimum wage, or whether that's in Bangladesh moving to another country from there, right? Because workers are trying to organize. So it's an interesting, that's like definitely one of the starker downsides of globalization. It's just this kind of exploitation of worker via surplus value. Anyway, I'll just keep talking about it if I don't move on. Let me move on from there. Oops. Skipped right over what I was trying to say. Okay, there we go. So other problems of the US workforce, we got the dual labor market. So basically the way this works is we know what this is, right? I don't even have to explain this to you. You already know what this is. So the idea is that there's two kinds of jobs, good ones and not great ones, right, in the US economy. And so basically there's the primary and the secondary labor market, right? And so the primary labor market are the ones that are rewarding. Like, not only are they like more comfortable jobs, but they pay more. They have benefits. They have those things like pensions and health insurance and actual paid sick days, time off, vacations, all sorts of stuff where you're like, what? Right? Lots of pay, lots of benefits. So those are the jobs that, like, the whole reason you're sitting through me yammering about this, right? Because you want to get a degree, you want to get a piece of paper so that they pay you more money, right? That's because you're trying to get into the primary labor market. If you have a job right now, it might be in the secondary labor market. I certainly had a billion of those jobs myself when I was younger. Those are jobs that provide workers with very low pay and few benefits. So hence why you have to have so many of them. Like, I mean, even right now, I have 4 jobs. Oh, that's such a sad reality. But anyway, not back to me and playing my violin, but, even in academia, it's like we have almost like a gig economy that's taking over. Because we know that, from an economic standpoint, it's easier to not give people good benefits, to not give them stability, and have people at a situation where they will just jump at whatever you offer them, right? Versus giving people full full-time positions means you give them some stability and security, which is something that often we rely upon. And really, that's like how the system of banking works. They want you to have like a job that isn't temporary, even though you've had that job that's temporary for many years. Like I remember years ago when I was still doing my journalism stuff, I interviewed this lady that she had been working at an elementary school, the same elementary school, for over 7 years. But every year they gave her a pink slip, and she had to return. She only found out like 2 weeks before the semester, or I mean before the school year started, if she even had a job again. And she'd been there 7 years, and then she still was never hired on, so she gained zero seniority. She was just considered a temporary worker. So even though she's going into the classroom, building relationships with these students, doing everything else that all the other teachers are doing, she's getting paid less. She didn't get the retirement. She didn't get the benefits that the others did. And she had that economic insecurity that she told me that when her and her husband tried to go buy a house, because they've been saving for years and they finally had the down payment and they, should be able to qualify based on how much they made, they turned them down at several banks because she was considered a temp worker, even though she'd been at her job for over 7 years. So we understand that there's like a lot of these awful loopholes that are being put into place in a lot of, not even just corporations, even like the state and the government jobs themselves have figured out how to get around to a lot of the primary labor market stuff that makes jobs worthwhile. So that's why you get the elder millennials like myself that are just angry, right? Because we were told that you get those jobs. You go to college and then all of a sudden they're like, here's a full-time job that's cush, that you get to like get paid well and have vacations, but you move up every once in a while and all of this kind of stuff. And that's just not the economy anymore, right? So we have to understand what the realities are so that we can understand what can we do to solve the social problems that come from these negative aspects of the economy. And especially when it comes to like voting for legislation or things like that, we need to be more informed, right? So that we can make better decisions about what kind of long-term ramifications some of these policies might have on the daily lived experiences of American families, right? Okay, so there's also a lot of issues with danger to workers, meaning not only is it hard to work in a situation where you're not getting paid enough to get by, but also there's a lot of industries that are just very dangerous, right? So about a century ago, about 100 people died every day while working in coal mines or in factories or, fishing, workplace fires, things like that. So obviously we have certain safety precautions that we put in place in different industries, but some jobs are just inherently dangerous, right? So mining is one of those that's been, ranked as one of the most dangerous types of work a person can do because, there can be an explosion, a fire, you could breathe in poisonous fumes, there can be a cave-in, right? All sorts of stuff. And we saw this with the whole situation around coal mining in recent political years, right? You had when Hillary was running for president, she had this whole thing about trying to transition coal miners from working within coal mines to working within more, either whether it's high-speed internet, solar panel installation, wind farm, something like that, to basically transition people to a more green economy. Because at this point, there's less people working in coal mines than work at Wendy's, right? The fast food restaurant Wendy's. So it's a dying industry. But more so than that, a lot of these people that work within those mines their whole lives develop a lot of health conditions like black lung. And it can be very difficult for them to get the full coverage, medical coverage that they need because they've been debilitated by working in their job. So there's like a whole other problem with this too. Right? We know farm equipment's much more safer than it was, but people still get really maimed by working with farm machinery and equipment. And we know this is even more so the case in the fact that with some farming, we're dealing with situations like field workers themselves are often being exploited, working in incredibly hot conditions for over 12 hours a day, and they have to like pay to get water in some situations. And so we know that because a lot of people that are working in farm working are undocumented, or they just kind of have this cyclical situation where they live, in parts of the Central Coast while they're harvesting, like they're often just not paid for the work that they deserve. They're often exploited, even to the point of being, violently harassed or even sexually assaulted. And so, farming is a hazardous industry, throughout, but especially for those who are the most marginal within that industry. Also, we have issues with toxic substances and radiation, right? So nearly every factory or production facility has some sort of chemical waste byproduct that comes out of that particular factory operation. And so, we know this stuff is harmful, but we know that, some workers are going to come in contact with that and they can have long-term effects, right? So for instance, my grandfather died of emphysema. He actually had emphysema for many years, suffered immeasurably for many years as a result of, he was an electrician and they put asbestos in the walls back in the day. And so he would, drill into walls a lot and breathe in a lot of that, toxic asbestos, right? Same thing with people that do a lot of sometimes installation, AC stuff, roofing, depending on if they're exposed to lead paint or other contaminants that we weren't really smart about in the past when we were building things. We didn't really think about long-term chemical impacts. Actually, it's kind of interesting. There's a whole documentary I want to somehow try to squeeze into this class that goes into that a little bit and talks about kind of the hubris of humans, that we're like, we can conquer nature, we can figure it out, and not realizing that we were like literally poisoning ourselves and giving ourselves cancer from all of this exposure to toxic chemicals. Radiation is another occupational hazard for many industries, and it comes with a risk of leukemia or other forms of cancer, which is very serious. And then, of course, workplace violence is a whole nother problem, right? So you have the situation where sometimes, someone breaks into a store, it murders a person, robs them or hurts them in some way. You also have, employees who actually go through some sort of self-inflicted violence or kill themselves in, at their workplace. But you also have this weird situation specifically for women, where one of the biggest hazards for them in the workplace is a jilted ex-partner or some sort of crazy person that thinks that you're in a relationship showing up to your work and killing you and killing your coworkers. And there's a lot of documented cases of this, right? Like, for instance, there was that Seal Beach one a couple years back, right, where this guy, he got upset. He was going through a custody battle with his ex-wife, and so he lost his job, went through some power status crap. And so he went to her workplace at a salon and killed her, and then killed all the people in the salon that were working with her and the people who were just like getting their hair done. Stuff like that. So it's really, really troubling that we live in a society where one of the biggest threats to women in the workplace is men, right? And not some of these other occupational hazards. Okay, other workplace problems, obviously alienation, right? So in Marx's view, alienation is just this feeling of powerlessness in your workplace, right? Which comes from being isolated and really being miserable because of the conditions of your work itself. So Marx said that capitalism alienates workers in 4 different ways. So it alienates workers from their jobs itself, right? Because you don't get to control what you do. You just have to do what they tell you to do. It alienates them from the products they make, right? So, for instance, it's not like if you're working on that factory line making a car that you get to keep the first car you make, right? You don't actually get any control over how it's done or what is done as you're making something. And then, of course, it alienates workers from each other, capitalism does, because it pits them in competition for one another. And it's, for instance, like let's say there's very scant few promotions or opportunities to rise to another level. So oftentimes workers are pitted against each other, even though they all have the same qualifications and deserve to move up. There's often very scarce positions, so it makes, instead of forming coalitions, we become enemies of each other. And then, of course, capitalism, last, Marx says that it alienates people from their human potential. It's what he called our species being. This idea that, we're more than just capitalism. We're more than our stupid job. We're more than how much productivity we can create, right? That if you're not able to get to be creative or have any input on your job or have any positive relationship with your coworkers, right? All of these things add up to create this alienation from our human potential, where we're not people, we're just cogs in a machine, right? Okay, so to build on that, on that very rosy picture, is Weber's view. So Weber looks at alienation as depersonalization, not just at work, but throughout society. That's really caused by what he sees as this rational focus on efficiency. So the way I like to think of it is, the rationalization stuff is basically like making everything computerized, making everything like about numbers and statistics and those kind of things. It removes a lot of the humanity from it. So rationalization of society is basically the historical change from tradition to rationality and efficiency. So basically, this has affected not just like the way we organize information, but really the way we see the world. And the goal of efficiency directs the operation of the workplace with little concern for the human cost of any policy or practice. We're not worried about, oh, is that going to make people not happy at work, right? We don't care, right? Because it's coming from a place of worrying about, the kind of rational goals of the institution or organization. And then even building upon this slightly further is McDonaldization, right? Or McJobs. So George Ritzer came up with this term, McDonaldization. And McDonaldization refers to defining work in terms of the principles of efficiency, predictability, uniformity, and automation. So basically, Ritzer breaks it down into these 4 components and says that this is the way that jobs are nowadays, and uses McDonald's as an example, but this is something we can apply to like so many other jobs, right? There's so many ways that these things kind of fit across the sector of society. He just really used McDonald's as a great example of this. Okay, so first up would be efficiency. So efficiency basically just means quantity over quality, right? So efficiency, McDonald's tries to serve food quickly and easily, right? If you've ever been to a fast food window, which I'm assuming you have, then you might have seen like a clock in the corner of the window where it literally tells you how long it's been since they got your order, to be able to hand it to you, right? And oftentimes there's certain standards by which, there's expectations of when they should be served by, right? If you look at the McDonald's arches, it doesn't say, I don't even actually remember the number anymore. I remember years ago when it was like, it finally went from million to billion served. But anyway, if it says like 1 billion served, it doesn't say like 1 billion people were happily satisfied with their meals. It just says, hey, 1 billion people shoved this in their face, right? So it's not about quality, it's about quantity. It's about popping out as many as possible, right? And then predictability is the second form of McDonaldization. So this is basically this idea that you set a formula for what's expected, and that no matter where you go, like which McDonald's you go to, you get the same thing. So you order a Big Mac at one place, you get it the same as a Big Mac at another place, right? Which means it never looks like the commercial. It looks like someone stepped on it. So they, prepare the food all the same way each time using set formulas, like literally like, a fish fillet, it's timed. Like you put it in the oil and a beeper goes off to tell you it's been cooked enough. The fries are all automated. All these things are set a certain way. The idea being that, again, you would be able to predict what it's going to be like that you're going to eat. It's going to be the same every time. Also, again, kind of going with that sameness and predictability is uniformity, meaning McDonald's serves meals that look and taste exactly the same in all of its restaurants. It's not like you have some restaurants where they're like, you know what, we really like things spicier here, so we make them spicy, or we add extra pickles or things like this. It's not like the chef gets to like kind of put any impact on that. There's no chef, right? The people who are cooking in these restaurants are often following a set kind of plan. I mean, this is so true. I remember as a kid, I think mostly because I was poor, this was part of the reason that my summer camp went to a McDonald's once and they showed us like how to make a fish fillet. I was like, well, they're just training us to be workers later on. But anyway, it was crazy. Like they literally like had a timer, everything was timed, and even the way you wrap it is super automated. Like you have to fold this way, then you roll it this way, then you stick on this sticker. Like it's super uniform. You're going to get the exact same look and taste across, like if you go to the McDonald's here, there, everywhere. It's so funny too. This is my joke with some of my sociology friends, how like Del Taco is like, it's a McDonaldized like anything else, but it has not done this uniformity very well, right? If you've been to Del Taco like me, or many Del Tacos like me, you know that they're definitely not all the same. There's like good Del Tacos and bad Del Tacos. So they just haven't gotten that uniformity down yet, right? Making it all taste the same at each one of the restaurants. And then the last one, again, with McDonaldization is automation. So basically like creating, or sometimes it's called control, or like basically taking humans out of the process. So minimizing human decision making. So if you automate every task, you can precisely control the production process. So again, like that kind of specific steps of here's how you make your fish fillet or whatever. You're not going to have like one chef does it this way, one chef does it that way. Everything's super controlled and automated. You literally remove humans from the process. So we could use the same kind of understanding of McDonaldization and apply it to other industries, right? So let's say right now we have like grocery stores are very McDonaldized. I don't know if that's really the right word for it. Have gone through McDonaldization, let's say that. So they have this thing with efficiency now where most grocery stores will try to give you a self-checkout machine option so you don't have to wait in line. The idea of the self-checkout is they only have to pay one cashier for like 5 stalls or more. So they make more money because they're able to get more people through the door without having to pay someone to actually ring them up. Fun fact, everyone at the self-check is actually much, much, much slower than the actual cashier because everyone thinks they know how to do it and they don't. They don't. Anyway, so using that same thing, predictability. If you went to, like for instance, I just went to Albertsons yesterday, so it's on my brain. If I go to an Albertsons, the way that a lot of these big chain stores work now is that their layouts are pretty much the same across all branch of that same store. So this is interesting. I used to work at a grocery store a million years ago. That didn't used to be the case. Sometimes they used to be flip design. But the idea is much more now so that they've, in the last 15 years, they've been trying to make them much more predictable, meaning you know that when you walk in, here's where the deli section's going to be. Here's where the frozen's going to be. Here's where this or that's going to be. So it creates this predictability. You know where things are going to be. And the uniformity, again, is that each one looks the same. They have the same features. They have the same foods and options, things like that. And then the automation, again, is using the self-check machines or even nowadays using Instacart shoppers, right? It's so funny, actually, since Ritzer came out with this, and this is like 2 decades ago, he came out with this McDonaldization idea. And McDonald's has even gotten more McDonaldized, right? I don't know, I haven't been in McDonald's in many years, but I heard that nowadays when you go in, there's not even someone at the counter anymore. You're just ordering on a tablet. So it's even more so using that automation, right? Because that, again, what does that mean? It's efficient too, because they can get more people in and out without having to pay people to actually take their order, so they make more money. It's just really interesting how we can apply that same kind of lens to many different jobs that, exist in our workplace today. Okay, another issue in the U.S. workplace is the temping of the workplace. So because of deindustrialization in the U.S. and all those factories moving to somewhere else, and a lot of the loss of even the white-collar jobs, right, that used to be for more kind of middle-class access, those ones have also moved to other places around the world, especially like South Asia. So that means that there's more and more people in the U.S. economy that are working at jobs that are considered temporary, right? So with temp jobs, I've worked many of these, it's really interesting, especially if we go through a temp agency directly, which I'm just going to go ahead and say, don't do that, right? It's hard to get access to some of these jobs. This is very true. But I myself, my husband did for years, like we've worked for temp agencies where, let's say the pay for the job you're actually doing is $15, but they're just giving you $8 and then taking some of that surplus value off of you, as the result of referring you to this job or whatever it might be. So that's really problematic. And again, it used to be a situation where you would temp a job to get a permanent job. Just like how people used to take an internship so you would get a permanent job, until corporations really realized that they could just keep getting a new intern every time and never had to pay anyone. And so this whole idea of getting your foot in the door and getting experience is really much more exploitive today than it used to be. Sorry, downer. Anyway, gig economy, a whole nother problem. So this is a work pattern in the U.S. where, companies and other organizations contract with independent workers for specific work over a short period of time. So meaning, a lot of the kind of gig work that we can think of today is related to those app-based kind of jobs like, Grubhub, DoorDash, Instacart, all those kind of things where like you are like lazy and sitting on your ass and you're like, hey, I really want some pineapple curry. Let me see if someone can bring it to my door, right? Which I am incredibly guilty of. So anyway, The way that this works, though, is especially with that new proposition that went through in California, now the understandings of kind of gig economy jobs is that because they're considered independent workers or independent contractors, is often the way the language works, they are exempt from benefits, from protections, and all sorts of other things that basically make it so that the companies have much more control over the workforce, that workers have very little power to come together and unionize or fight back and gain, better wages, better work conditions, things like that. They're pretty much just beholden to what they can with the company. And the idea of a gig economy is like, oh, you drive an Uber after work to make a little bit more money. But that just assumes that people already have good jobs and that they're just trying to make a couple extra bucks. When the reality is a lot of gig economy workers are working multiple gig economy jobs in the same car. They're driving that Uber, and then they're picking up that DoorDash, and then they're going and doing that Grubhub, and they're doing all of those things at the same time. And so, it goes against this idea that it's just like a second extra job or just some extra little money on the side, when this is like people's primary income at this point. Unemployment is a complicated thing too, right? Obviously, we don't want people to be unemployed, but to be even counted as unemployed, you have to be registered with the unemployment office and actively seek work. So a lot of people who are out of work never actually register. So we don't really know the full numbers of the unemployed. Also, people really get discouraged because, they look for work, they find nothing, they, give up. And so what happens is the official employment statistics only count people as unemployed for a couple of years. And then after that, if they can't get back into the labor market, they just fall off the percentages of people who are unemployed. So that's a huge problem because we're not really seeing the reality of those actual workers, right? So, some of the reasons for unemployment is just someone's laid off from their job, or, some people are just new to the labor force, and so they're looking for work. They just got out of college and they're trying to get that job, or, some people are just between jobs, right? And so when the economy is weak, the government often, really cuts down on the kind of financial protections it has, or the kind of financial programs it has for folks that are struggling, right? So if you cut more welfare programs and force more people into the labor force, that was really the goal of the 1990s Welfare Reform Acts. And so some people would say, well, look, there's less people on welfare, so that means that it worked. But in reality, there's still more people, even more people, that are poor now than then. So if success is less people are getting government benefits, then sure, it's a success, because if you put a 5-year limit on on how much you can get, then that cuts people off the rolls pretty quickly. But if the measure of success is less people struggling in poverty, then it obviously did not work. So we know that also unemployment is also connected to those social categories. And so unemployment rates for certain communities of color, especially African American and Latinx communities, tend to be much higher than those for white communities. And then there's this problem of missing workers. Again, those are the people who were working in the past, but just now are no longer working or looking for work because they can't. One reason could be that, like when the recession happened, a lot of companies went to a smaller workforce and then just never built back up from there. Also, there was a lot of kind of motivation again for the U.S. corporations that are transnational corporations that can just work out of somewhere else to just move their factories or office hubs somewhere else, like China, India, Brazil, wherever, and pay people much less than they would pay them here. So it's really just a issue of not having, it's not that there's no jobs, it's that there's no good paying jobs, and that when there are, they're incredibly difficult to get. So, also sometimes when you're trying to transition to a new job criteria, it's difficult to do that if you don't have the right skills or training. So this is like going back to that Hillary example from before, of taking coal miners and training them to go into these other jobs for free so they could work within those sectors. Like something like that's necessary for a lot of job industries, because if you rely upon a low wage worker to have to pay to be educated to transition to a new job requiring different skill sets, there's very few people that have that opportunity to do that, right? And not just go much farther into debt. So the low wage recovery is just talking about how after that last recession the major recession, 2007, 2008, obviously COVID has its own impacts as well, but that, millions of jobs have been created, but they're low wage jobs. They're low wage jobs that don't have benefits. And this is especially true for jobs that are taken by younger adults, right? That these are jobs that you just can't support a family in the middle class with those jobs, even if you're working full time. Okay, so some other issues in the workplace. Women and other minorities are still not equally represented in many of the better paying jobs, the ones that have all that security and such. Often women and racial or ethnic minorities are the last ones hired and the first ones fired. So part of this is institutional discrimination. So meaning it's not that it's bias from, someone's on a hiring committee and they're like, I don't like women, I won't hire women, right? It's more that institutional discrimination is bias that's built into the operation of the economy, of education, and other social institutions. So it doesn't always involve people intentionally treating someone unfairly, but institutional discrimination can just result from unfair treatment in the past that got built into the system and created these ideas. Or even just our social understandings, like, for example, this idea that men are better suited to be leaders than women, right? That's been a very patriarchal belief system in our culture for generations. So as a result, we see this situation of the glass ceiling, which of course there's other factors that also influence or create the glass ceiling, but that's just one aspect of it, the kind of social justification. So the glass ceiling is just that many workplaces have this barrier that prevents women or racial ethnic minorities or other minorities as well, so such as LGBTQ communities, from moving upward in the workplace, right? So they can maybe be a supervisor but not a manager, not a district manager, not a general manager, not move up high enough within those things. It's like this invisible barrier that says that you've gotten as far as you can get, right? And so that's a big problem that affects a lot of different communities, largely just because of who they're identified with and not as a measure of their personal skill or opportunity or, ability, basically. And then workplace segregation is also linked to race and ethnicity and, of course, gender, because many occupations in the U.S. workforce are actually highly segregated by race or highly segregated by gender. So when it comes to racial and ethnic minorities, they're often concentrated in the least desirable jobs that pay the less, that also have more hazards to them, right? While white men predominate the most desirable jobs that have the most compensation and the most benefits. So women are still trailing men when it comes to leadership positions, but at the same time, women are overrepresented in low status positions in the business world. So meaning there's still plenty of women in business, but they're working as secretaries or other office employees. They're often working in industries that, if they're female-dominated industries, they therefore are considered less worthwhile and often have less status and less pay, meaning women are predominantly in jobs that care for young people, like childcare workers and teachers, but because those jobs are associated more with women, they have less status and less pay. Okay, so when it comes to labor unions, this is something that's obviously very connected to some of these problems getting much, much worse in recent years. So labor unions are just worker organizations that seek to improve wages and working conditions through various strategies, including negotiations with the companies or the state or whatever the employer is themselves. And this could also mean, strikes or walkouts or things like this. So just briefly, before we can talk about unions, we have to talk about what happened to unions, right? So the first large-scale workers' organizations were established in the 1880s at the height of the Industrial Revolution, right? And again, because people were dying in factory labor, people were getting maimed, all sorts of horrible conditions that people were working in, not let alone the fact that children were working in these factories and all sorts of stuff that we wouldn't consider today. So meaning, if you've only heard propagandistic negative things about unions, then you might not know that the reason we have weekends is because of unions. The reason we have an 8-hour workday and not a 12 or 16-hour workday is because of unions, right? The fact that we have fire exits, situations where there can be grievance processes like HRs where you can go and complain about your boss treating you negatively. All of these things come out of unions. So if you like the fact that you don't have to work 7 days a week, 16 hours a day, then thank a union. But anyway, so in the Great Depression in the 1930s, worker organizations made very important gains during that time period. So the collapse of the economy put forth this kind of change, or this motivation to change what was going on, right? And so obviously a lot of people lost their jobs during the Great Depression, like a quarter of all people. So the government took notice of this and actually started trying to, create some sort of protections for this. This is where we get those kind of unemployment protections, which again was part of that kind of New Deal stuff being put out to protect laborers themselves. And so by 1950, unions claimed about 1/3 of the entire U.S. non-farm labor force. In terms of absolute numbers, union membership peaked in the 70s at about 25 million people. So when you look at unions today, this is very different. So the number of factory jobs or work that's often heavily unionized has declined after 1950. So since then, most new jobs that have existed have really been in the service sector of the economy, which is not at all likely to be unionized. In 2017, just 11% of all non-farm workers were members of a labor union, and just 30% or 34% of workers in the public sector. We have this incredible decline in union membership. At the same time, you have this incredible increase in corporate profits, and even going from having multimillionaires to having many, many billionaires, to even soon to potentially having trillionaires. Oh, Jesus. Anyway, efforts to increase unionization have really kind of tried to get people to understand what the union can actually do for them. And there's been some really interesting, very recent changes, such as the first union ever for Amazon, right? You had these workers come together. There's actually a really interesting story of that too, how basically the president of that union was fired for trying to organize members at that particular Amazon factory. So these are Amazon workers themselves that formed their own union. And it's a really important, beautiful thing to see some, small group of workers saying, no, we still do think that our power collectively can go up against this incredibly powerful billionaire, right? So as they've unionized that first Amazon warehouse, there's been a lot of interest in unionizing others. Starbucks also had one Starbucks location that became its first unionized location recently. So hopefully, maybe because of COVID and the way that work also is very kind of similar to the 1930s, it really changed people's understanding of their jobs. And now that there's slightly more worker power, people are using it. And as a result, you have the people that run these places or on the corporate boards or the CEOs are making incredibly huge amounts of money, have to rip out existing bridges so you can move your mega yacht into the harbor kind of wealth, while the workers are struggling and often using, food stamps or things like this just to financially support themselves. They're working conditions where, they're working long hours, they're doing a lot of heavy lifting. And as we've all heard about with Amazon, you have a lot of situations where workers can't even take their breaks. They're peeing into bottles, right? Because they can't, just the time it takes to walk to the other side of the factory where the bathroom is and back, they've already taken their whole break. So a lot of the conditions are just really not suited to the workers. And so it should be really interesting to see what happens now that there might, start to be more unionized attempts to kind of rein in this outrageous power of corporations in America. So let's move on a little bit to kind of how the workplace has changed, right? So, in this industrial age, obviously in the past, people in the industrial age just made stuff, right? Today, we develop literacy skills and we create and manipulate symbols, right? So it could be computer code, it could be music, ideas, you could design a building, right? Lots of different ways to work. So when it comes to home as workplace, an increasingly popular option, especially for workers in the gig economy, is to use computer technology to work from home. And we saw a lot of this happen especially with COVID, as a lot of workers had to move home to work from home. And as much as, there's some loss of interaction with peers and things like that, and there are some negative downsides, especially when you're trying to have your child go to school while you're also working from home, right? That's very difficult to manage. But in general, a lot of people found working at home to be positive in many ways, meaning they could wear their sweatpants. They didn't have to commute all that time that they spent, getting dressed, doing their hair, doing their makeup, driving to an external location, etc., could now just be spent in the home. Like I know for myself, teaching online or having this kind of option to do an async course has given me this opportunity where I can record these lectures, I can do these things from home, but I can also, have a load of laundry running at the same time. Like these kind of things that, like my days off used to just be literally just do laundry all day or something like that. So for a lot of folks, it gives more flexibility, especially people that have young families, right? Where they want to be able to spend time with young ones that are developing that are preschool aged. So, this can be a good option, but it is really interesting. I think just to note, there's this really great book called Disability Visibility. And one of the vignettes in the book talks about how it's pretty crazy how so many industries moved online, through Zoom and other kind of factors so that people could work from home. Though a lot of people with, that are disabled have been saying for years they need to have their home as a workplace. They need to have more options because commuting and also a lot of the kind of specific ways that offices are set up are not equitable and they're not set up for people that are disabled. And so it's just kind of ironic that when able-bodied people need to stay home and work, it's like, no problem, we can move mountains, we can make that happen. But so a lot of communities, disabled communities were like, what is going on when everything moved online? Like, oh, so they can do that. They just don't do that for workers that need that the most, right? Also, workplace isolation can be a lot of problems, meaning even if we are working in the workplace together, we're just sitting in like little cubicles or facing computers, not really having a lot of contact with other people. Also, when it comes to supervision, right? Some organizations use computer technology to monitor workers. So, to see how often you're completing orders or maybe to just have a camera right behind you that observes what you're doing all the time. So it controls the working lives of employees more than before. And it just makes you feel like uncomfortable, like not trusted, not valued as a worker. And then, of course, we also have the de-skilling of workers, which is basically using computers or having more decisions made without direct human assistance. So de-skilling managers and threatening their jobs. And so it just means that even workers in primary labor market are eventually going to have their jobs replaced if they can figure out a way to replace all the managers, all the supervisors, all the things with some computer, with some algorithm. They'll do it because that will save them so much money. So we have to understand that whatever happens to the kind of the people that are the most marginal in the workplace or in the kind of economy, that can also happen to everyone else that does have more privilege. It just happens to them first and works its way up the chain. So we do see that it's interesting, this kind of de-skilling idea, that the more and more they can kind of automate all aspects of work, this will happen, right? Okay, so let's look at some of the theories and how they understand it. So structural functional analysis is looking for new equilibriums. So they explain as a theory how technological change reshapes the economy. So again, going back to what we talked about with the Industrial Revolution, that was a driving force behind the economy of the 20th century. So just in a very similar way, the Information Revolution has really set the stage for the economy of the 21st century. So now, just like in the past, technology is a very key factor to shaping work in the workplace. So various social institutions are interrelated. That's the way that functionalism looks at these things, is how different institutions connect and influence each other. So they argue that a change in one social institution leads to adjustments in all the others. So the disruption of past economic patterns eventually brings about a new social order. Okay, moving on to symbolic interaction analysis. They always look for meanings in interaction. And so they're looking at the meaning of work, focusing on the meanings that people attach to the surrounding world as they construct their everyday lives. So people with jobs in the primary labor market define their work in positive terms, and they think that their work reflects well on them, right? Because if you have a fancy job and a fancy title and a nice fat paycheck, you're like, look at me, I'm awesome, right? But that is definitely not the case for people in the secondary labor market that find very little positive meaning in their work, and they see the job mostly as just a source of income, right? Not as something that positively defines who they are. And this is something that's, again, I know this is not what they go into in the book, but I can't help myself, just a slight little sprinkle on top here. Think about this from a gendered aspect as well, right? We have this interesting thing in society that kind of is a holdover from past generations where we really connect men to their jobs much more than we do to women. Meaning, if a woman has a job and it's like not that prestigious, we don't really look at her as negatively as we do a man, right? A man, one of the first things we ask him is, what do you do? Right? And that's part of the way that we judge him and his worth and his social worth and value. So I just kind of want to point that out too, that even the meanings that we have associated with those kind of works have a lot to do with who's doing it as well. Okay, moving on to social conflict analysis. They're looking at work from the context of inequality within work. So social conflict theory links the workplace to specifically social inequality, as Marx explained, right? That kind of capitalistic elite that they don't really work, right? You have a lot of people that they're making 400 times what their lowest employees or their middle employees making, and they're clocking in for a couple hours and then going and hitting the golf course, right? So he's saying that a lot of the elite aren't doing the work, but gaining all the profit from the work that's done by their employees. So as long as the workplace operates according to the rules of a capitalistic economy, work is going to be exploitive because it's going to give the money and the products of the many to the few. So in the case of work, this approach highlights how the economy operates to provide very different opportunities and benefits for those who are advantaged and those who are disadvantages, or those who face disadvantages. And then a feminist analysis really looks at how gender segregates the workplace according to sex. So jobs that are viewed as masculine provide the greatest wealth and social power, while jobs that are considered feminine are disadvantaged in terms of income, power, and prestige. So we can always think of a couple examples of these, right? There's a lot of jobs that, just think of it this way, if you have to put the word female or male in front of it, then we know it's already associated with the other gender. So for example, if you have to say female pilot, female doctor, then we're assuming that doctor, pilot means male. Or if you have to say male nurse, male, elementary school teacher or something like that, then we know that nurse and elementary school teacher is just assumed feminine. So when we look at these things, this is why when we talk about the pay gap, it's very difficult to address, because it's not just about equal pay for equal work. It's also, we're working in a segregated economy. Okay, so then finally just looking at constructing problems and defining solutions. So how do different political viewpoints understand this? So conservatives say look to the market. They claim that the free market economy, so meaning not regulating the economy by the government, creates the most good for the greatest number of people. So they see the operation of a free market as the solution to many of the needs. To them, extensive government regulation of the economy is the problem. So for this reason, most conservatives supported the Trump administration's effort to reduce the size and scope of the government and those huge tax cuts, which were such a transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich. And then when you look at the liberals, they say look to the government, right? Again, the whole point of liberals is that they always say you can change it by changing laws, right? So liberals see a need for government regulation to protect the interests of everyone, especially low-income people, immigrant communities, other workers that are much more vulnerable in the market that might not get that same opportunity within the free market because they're not considered as socially valued as wealthy white people, right? So liberals also seek government action to protect people from workplace hazards, right? And to protect workers' rights when it comes to being able to collectively organize and join labor unions. So then you have the radical left that say, basic change is needed. The workers should own and control the means of economic production. The idea is that if the workers have some control over the industry they're a part of, they get some stock holdings, they get some share of the profits, and then they get some sort of input on what decisions should and shouldn't be made. This is a real different way to approach the economic problems within capitalism and actually invest workers in the process themselves, right? So instead of having just CEOs and corporate boards making all the decisions, you have the workers themselves also having a seat at that table. Radical left says that government should act in the interest of the entire population and not just the wealthiest and the most privileged, and they should be responsible for the economic policies that are put into place. So it seems likely that the nation's going to continue to rely upon a market economy because it's generated so much wealth for those billionaires. right? So going on from here, the challenge will be whether the US political and economic system can be made to operate, and not just so that some people can find economic security and most people can't, right? So, that's going to be the kind of challenge for the future, is how are we going to create a system so that more Americans can be kind of lifted up from this situation. Just like with that film Inequality for All, looking at the virtuous cycle, this idea of, there's more people getting an education, those people are able to get better jobs, those jobs are more productive and people have more money, so they can spend more money, and they spend more money, that creates more jobs, and it creates this virtuous cycle, right, where, the government then has more money from taxes, they can create more programs to lift more people out of poverty, those people can get an education, then they themselves can make more money, spend that money in the economy, and the cycle just keeps going and going. So I think that's why, Inequality for All as a film is something that I wanted to kind of push at you to watch, because I think it's important to show how a lot of these kind of large-scale structural changes can have big impacts on people's everyday lived experiences, and how as individuals we have, very little kind of direct impact that we see in our own lives, but we don't realize how collectively we are, kind of facing these patterns. So when you're dealing with the opposite of the virtuous cycle, and education's cut, people can't get better jobs, they don't have that stability in the economy, so they spend less, so companies can hire less people, they cut their wages, and then government programs get cut, and then it just creates this negative problem. So I think he makes such a great point when he says, people are always like, well, what country should we emulate, what should we look at? And he says we should look at America in the past, and how when we did have more regulation in the economy, when we did have much higher tax rate on the kind of 1%, or the basically like the top 10% of the wage earners, that we created that virtuous cycle where even the rich people were still rich, but the people who were like upper middle class were much more stable than they are today. And right now we have the situation where the middle class is shrinking or diminishing. So going on from here, it should be interesting to see how politically those changes that are put into place can have ripple effects over generations on the economy.